David Bentley Hart is brilliant. And the thing I think I appreciate most about him, he's a patristics scholar as opposed to just a theologian in general. One of the things I found is that he's Eastern Orthodox, and Eastern Orthodox theologians, especially patristic theologians, read the early church fathers. Evangelical Christians jump from the apostles to the reformers, and they skip everything in between. Roman Catholic theologians focus primarily on the Latin fathers, Augustine and those kinds of people. The thing about the early Greek fathers is that they were closest to the apostles because they were earlier in time, and they read the New Testament in their native tongue. So they understood what was really going on far better than any of the people after them. And so I really appreciate the fact that David Bentley Hart, just brilliant theologian who reads the original languages and reads the people who wrote in the original language, and has been able to just be phenomenal in terms of communicating what he has believed, which is that God is going to ultimately restore all. I just love what he's written. Sometimes he's a little bit, he can cause controversy because of the way he states things, but in a real way that makes people think more. And I'm grateful for that as well, that he says things in such a way that people really have to think about what he has to say.
I really like the punchiness of David's work. Yeah, that he holds no punches with regard to the way he expresses things in all of that, and I find it very fresh and very invigorating.
You've got folks who, with a very heavy theological hand, have held doctrines like eternal conscious torment over people in ways that created religious PTSD and actually drove them away from Jesus. Hart comes along and he is smarter than them. He's better with philosophy and theology and scripture than them. And what he does is such a thorough and deep work that you can't even have a conversation about that anymore without reference to him, or you shouldn't. and so even though he can sound abrasive, and he knows it, I just think on some issues like that one, his kind of argument for ultimate redemption of all people, I have not seen an answer to his arguments that actually take his arguments seriously. Usually they have to resort to mudslinging, which is easier if you don't like the guy. But I really appreciate what he's done with that, and I feel like he's made a difference in that way that I think is important.
He gave one of the lectures, the Brown Orthodox Student Fellowship, the Eastern Orthodox churches, they would have, I think they still do, have an annual lecture on the feast day of St. Gregory Nyssa in the spring, and he gave one of those lectures. So I was there. The big thing, at least that I should mention, are the fact that he is obviously bright and thoroughly understands what he's talking about. And I used to read his back page column in the journal First Things, which he did until recently. But as a Greek Orthodox theologian, he really understands the Trinitarian theology and the patristic stuff from the 4th century and like that. And of course, he was very clear. He says the Greek fathers in the 4th, they were all universalists theologically because of the nature of God. They reason from the nature and the being of God, not the functionality of persons and like that. And they always said, they taught us, they said, the Greeks have taught us that you've got to start with the persons because of the relationship between them and a common nature. And so when Winchester said God whose nature is love, that's really key. And I picked up on that from listening to the Greeks and reading David Bentley Hart's book. And sure enough, the critics of his book, I saw it reviewed, for example, in National Review, to which I subscribe, And I actually printed a letter in response to all this that they ran. But Hart was reviewed by this kind of Thomist Roman Catholic theologian up at McGill in Montreal. And his reaction to Hart's work was just what David Hart said about this issue of universal salvation. They really have this function on human choice and human affirmation more than, and therefore some people make it and some people don't. Whereas he said, if you talk about the very being and nature of God, that's what matters. But he says the people who oppose that understanding are really, they won't let go of human choice. We've got to have human freedom and choice, and even if that means a few people get fried in the process, it's so important. And so they will guard that theologically in putting together their systems, whereas David Bentley Hart was on the other, said, no, that's not how you do this. It's not how the Greek fathers did it. And he laid all that out with erudition and a deep understanding of where the forks in the road are theologically when the categories are developed. And so Catherine Lacuna, who was deceased of blessed memory, she was a theologian, Roman Catholic at Notre Dame. I've read her book. We had a group that studied it for a couple of years in Boston called God for Us, most important thing I've read since I was ordained. And it was the same thing. She talked about the defeat of the doctrine of the Trinity in the West, citing Aquinas, etc., and saying you've got to go back the way the Greeks did, and that dovetails with John Zazoulis, who was a predecessor there, Greek Orthodox theologian, still around, I think, and David Bentley Hart. Those are the guys who've developed some of that Eastern Orthodox patristic stuff, and they really understand it, and it's been a real contribution, but not everybody likes it.
I have tried to read a few of his books, but they are hard to penetrate for me, coming from another language, another culture. But I appreciate his work, of course, but I even more appreciate the person. That's more where my focus is. So I visited him and his family 2 times, and we had a very nice time together, walking the dog and whatnot. So it's more on a personal level for me than all his complicated thoughts.
David Bentley Hart is a man whose courage I admire. He's a man who's willing to be a contrarian. It reminds me of somebody else I know named the Apostle Paul, and even beyond that, named Jesus Christ. I think that spiritual truth that comes from the heart of God is going to always stand in contrast to the dogma of established religion. The religionist did not embrace or accept what Jesus had to say 20 centuries ago or 21 centuries ago, nor are they going to embrace what he has to say today. So David Bentley Hart has my respect. That's not to say that I agree with him on every point, but heck, I don't even agree with my own wife on every point, so that's okay. But I do have great respect for the man, and I appreciate the courage that he shows to stand up for the gospel of pure grace the way he does.
I love David Bentley Hart's work. He has been an incredible influence on me, especially when I read his book, That All Shall Be Saved. That's kind of my first understanding of him. Dr. Hart has an incredible grasp, I think, on the nature of God, which is what That All Shall Be Saved really showed in an extremely great light. I mean, he has a really great understanding of the nature of God, the nature of Christ, the pivotal importance of love that is central to who God is and who Christ is. Before in time, we had these deities, and there wasn't really this God of love, of forgiveness, of humility, of meekness, of service. It was in Judaism to a point, but Christ really brought that to the foray, and Christ is who God is. If you've seen me, you've seen the Father. I think what David Bentley Hart does is he's able to kind of put that together with the theology that we would call, full restoration or universal reconciliation or universalism. He's able to see that relationship and how it applies to mankind through history, through language, through theology, philosophy. He kind of blends all those together in a nice marriage so that people can understand it?
Well, in the first place, David Bentley Hart and I agree on a host of theological issues. So it's easy to admire somebody that agrees with you, I guess. But we agree not only that universal salvation is possibly true, but that it is itself a metaphysical necessity. It's not possible that God would have created these additional persons to love and have permitted them, say, to be separated from Him forever. And he and I also agree on the concept of freedom. We might call it a kind of rational freedom. A necessary condition of freedom is that one has passed, I think, a threshold, a minimal threshold of rationality. And I'm sure that he also probably agrees with me on the idea that even a creation of some kind or another is a metaphysical necessity. I'm not absolutely certain of that, but it seems to me from what I've read in him that he would agree with that as well. But there's a more important point to be made here. It's not just that he agrees with me, but he has an expertise in the languages of the Bible, particularly Greek, that I don't have. And he has a comprehensive understanding or knowledge of church history and the writings of early Christian theologians, particularly in the East, that I don't have. So I really do appreciate all of that. And then he has a book, that All Shall Be Saved, that I think is a very worthy contribution to the subject of universal reconciliation.
The thing I love most, and I wish I knew him personally, honestly, I wish we could be friends because I delight in his sense of humor. I often think, I don't know who said this first, and I shouldn't even guess, but I saw someone once online refer to David as a kind of holy fool. And I think there's something really true to that, right? That if you don't hear the humor in what he's doing, the sense of, I mean, not self-mockery, that's not quite right, but there's such a kind of delighted, like G.K. Chesterton, like playfulness in what he's doing. I don't know that he would take that as a compliment, which is part of what I love about it, right? I remember once he was responding to something I had written, and I had said that I worried at times that he might become a caricature of himself, that he gets so caught up in that. And that's certainly true of Chesterton, if it's not true of Hart. But in his reply to me, he said that he had always hoped to be a caricature of H.L. Mencken. And for those who know Mencken's work, like, I think that's the register in which a lot of, especially the stuff he does on the fly, the stuff he does in podcast interviews or public lectures, debates, etc. I think Hart, but not only that. I mean, I think, again, I don't know him personally. We've never had a chance to have the conversation, but that's how I read him, at least, and how I hear him.
How do you hope people remember you after your death?
As an extremely talented writer. I think, I'm hoping, I'm never going to be rich and famous in this world, but I'd like after I die, say maybe 40 years after my death, there'd be some great revival of interest in my work. And people would say, oh my God, these stories are so well written, That's how I want to be remembered. Plus, I want to be remembered for certain aphorisms that can be taken out of my work. For instance, I begin one article with about the new atheists, about Adam Gopnik, with the sentence, journalism is the art of translating abysmal ignorance into execrable prose. I want to be remembered for that, in some sort of future version of Bartlett's Book of Quotations.